Hi friend, welcome to the India chapter of Part 1, Technology of Non-Human Visitations. This chapter was extremely difficult to produce. You see, I wanted to just start presenting the full evidence of the Vimana, any counterclaims, and all the other aspects of claimed technologies that have been attributed to supporting the idea of flying Vimana. But what I kept coming across was evidence more along the lines of a belief system rather than scientifically tested. I also came across incomplete research from people I had assumed previously provided full disclosure and transparency of their research material. Recurring argumentative issues with schools of thought, a rarely identified likelihood of cultural and modernism influences affecting translations, concepts, and contexts. And what I also came across was an ever-present debate amongst Indian, Western, and Asian academics concerning the validity of ancient Sanskrit, Vedic, Brahmana, and Purana texts. In short, these concerns of mine stem from two major factors I discovered and analyzed during my research. The first factor of concern was the lack of primary texts that are often cited as originating some 2,000 to 3,500 years before our modern times. The second factor was the lack of transparency and full disclosure of evidence that could have been revealed to us by other researchers, but for reasons I can only guess at, they chose not to discuss all other evidences. Now, I wrote and rewrote this prologue about 6 times, trying to find a way to give you some background, the analytic focus, a breakdown of corroborating evidence and its discrepancies, and all other aspects of my research. In the end, I just couldn't find a good way of doing it that made this production even remotely entertaining as well as informative to watch. I think it's a better course to simply show you the analytic bottom lines up front, then show you how we got there by going over the evidence, all the evidence, step by step. So with that, let's get some definitions and analytic standards down so you'll better understand what the heck I'm talking about as we go into the discovery and analysis of evidence concerning the Vimana. Definitions. The first thing we need to define is what is evidence. Oxford English Dictionary says, evidence is the available body of facts or information indicating whether a belief or proposition is true or valid. Now, in order for that evidence to be considered admissible in a court of law, and not something some feller just made up because it seemed right in his own mind, evidence must meet 3 standards to establish a valid or true proposition. Now, for simplicity's sakes, let's say there is a case between parties A and B, where party A disputes that a verbal agreement to do something in exchange for money was agreed upon. Party B is making claim that a verbal agreement was made to do something but the agreed upon money was never provided as compensation for the work, per the verbal agreement. Well, first, evidence should be relevant. This means that the evidence is considered relevant to the position being presented by a party in order to determine a degree of probability that the evidence being presented is true or valid to the case. An example of this kind of evidence for relevant consideration would be Party B, under sworn testimony and penalty of perjury, claims it was raining on Wednesday. Now, that could be considered relevant evidence and information if all parties agree, and there is other evidence to corroborate or confirm the fact being presented. But the fact will likely be considered irrelevant to the case in point. That is, was a verbal agreement made or not? Even if the fact being presented was corroborated by other people that it indeed rained on Wednesday, the date and the event is irrelevant to the point of the fact in case. You see, the time, presence of witnesses, location, verbiage of the agreement, and other facts of the proposition are not established by whether it rained or not, so it's irrelevant. Second, evidence is also material. That is, material evidence is a sworn statement or other evidence submitted to simply prove a fact as true or not. An example of this is an affidavit by a witness being submitted by Party B attests that it was indeed raining on Wednesday. Now that would be considered irrelevant, as we already covered, because it does not establish a significant relationship to the case in point, which remains a verbal agreement was made between two parties. Now let's also say that the affidavit further attested that the two parties in question did indeed shake hands and agree to a verbal agreement in question. The statement that they shook hands and agreed to the verbal agreement would now be considered material. But what if Party A provides a witness that states Party B's witness could not have known that a verbal agreement was made because Party B's witness was driving by the two parties in question at 15 to 25 miles an hour with the radio loudly thumping out bass sounds while on their cell phones, with the windows of that car only 1/4 way down, and that Party B's witness was at least 50 feet from the parties in question. With that new evidence, Party B's witness may be considered relevant and material, but only the part of the affidavit where the evidence establishes a handshake between the two parties occurred. Well, this brings us to the third part of what is admissible evidence, and that is, evidence is also competent. That means the evidence was found sufficient to determine the reliability of a claimed fact. But there are at least two more key aspects of competent evidence. Competent evidence must not intentionally cause harm. That the evidence was provided in good faith without hope to cause harm to a party. The other aspect is that the evidence has an established foundation of testing and evaluation, meaning that an expert or professional with established credentials and a history of valid and true testimony can prove or disprove a fact of evidence. So, in this case, the evidence of Party B's witness, the one that said they saw a handshake, could be considered competent if the only fact of visual acuity, peering through a window at 50 feet in the presence of rain and loud music while on a cell phone, can be established that a handshake took place. That type of evidence meets the reasonable person's test of most juries. But the claim that a verbal agreement was made must remain as non-competent evidence because of the additional factors presented in the sworn testimony. But listen, a dishonest person could argue that the evidence was competent, that at a certain time, in a certain location, two parties shook hands, and it could be inferred that a verbal agreement occurred. That's called speculation. And as I have said on numerous occasions, This production does not engage in speculation of evidence. Okay, I know that sounded like a lot of legal mumbo-jumbo, but it is the definition for the admissibility of evidence and is seriously important to me and this production. And that's because 1. Anyone can present evidence and facts in the absence of all available evidence. 2. When people obfuscate or leave out pieces of information, whether intentionally or accidentally, and they go about touting their evidence as fact, even in the face of other admissible evidence that may contradict their claims, whether knowingly or unwittingly, there arises a serious impact to the credibility of the claimant and the claimed fact. And that, folks, is called disinformation, deception, misinformation, obfuscation, and lying. Some people do it deliberately, some for kicks, and some maybe just because they've become self-convinced that their facts are right. Not just relative to that person's perspective, but actually more true than anyone else's evidence. So, you may ask, why do people not believe in aliens and supernatural beings? It is that human condition, the condition of prevarication and distrust of others because of the lies. This is why there is a gap between those who believe in something, whether it's a UFO, a religious idea, or something paranormal. It's simply because there are a lot of people who intentionally or unintentionally have not revealed all the evidence for whatever reason. So, that brings us back to the objective of this production, the discovery and analysis of all available evidence. The purpose of discovery will always remain focused on the findings of events, evidence, testimonies, and belief systems, and apportion that information into parts, which I call Part 1, the technological, Part 2, biological, 3, spiritual, 4, psychological, and 5, the transdimensional nature of the non-human visitation phenomenon. The purpose of analysis will always remain on providing corroborated corollaries of data and information to form, hopefully, irrefutable conclusions. These conclusions are provided in Part 6 of this production. And these corollaries are derived from informational bona fides, misdirection mechanisms, disinformation paradigms, and admissible evidence. Look, guys, I don't pretend to even have some of the answers to this objective and purpose. But again, that's why I need you. I can only do so much by myself. But if you can provide any additional insights or data, and hopefully that data is primary text or from a certified expert or professional in the field of research you have information about, I swear I will thank you publicly and provide corrections if any information on this production is found in error. Now, let's get into some standards. That brings us to a simplified scale I made for you so you can see how the evidence was adjudicated or assessed after the analysis. I call this the Analytic Standard Scale of Evidence. I know, big fancy word, but I kind of like the sound of it. Here we go. 1. Being at the low end of the scale. Fails all tests of evidence with clear attempt to defraud. 2. Fails all tests of evidence with no contest to perjure. We don't know if the guy lied on purpose or not. 3. Fails competency and material or relevant tests. 4. Competent evidence is allowed to prove a relevant or material fact which may have been improper to receive otherwise. 5. Questionable evidence, highly subject to appeal. 6. Evidence was at least 75% accurate, but corroboration was limited to one other technical, academic, or other non-affidavit source. 7. Evidence was tested as accurate by multiple sources, but all of whom are also non-affidavit. When I say non-affidavit, I mean It's not a sworn testimony. They're not legal. They're not experts. They're not professionals in the field. But a whole bunch of people say it. Okay? 8. There is a history of accurate evidence, but with corroboration limited to only one other affidavit source that is also not accessible to the source. 9. There is a history of accurate evidence with corroboration from other multiple affidavit sources. 10. This information is irrefutable. It is always 100% accurate, like water is wet. Okay, so now you know what it means when I put an assessment number, as we just defined in the scale, when we are talking about the analysis of a certain piece of evidence. And hey, one last thing. The assessment is only about a piece of evidence. It is not the final conclusion. Those final conclusions, after looking at the entire body of evidence and after getting additional insights and feedback from other analysts, resources, and from you, assessments, like verdicts, can change when new evidence is admitted, and I sure ain't stupid enough to think that I got all the know in my knower. So, with that, let's do the discovery and analysis thing on this Vimana doohickey.